beneath the polished surface of a luxury bank in Houston, one man's silent weight became a reckoning that shook an entire institution. Byron Ellis, a respected black entrepreneur, arrived early for his appointment, only to be ignored, overlooked, and made invisible while others were ushered through with effortless ease. But what began as another routine act of polite exclusion turned into a powerful confrontation that exposed a system built to favor appearances over merit. This is the story of how one man, armed with dignity and resolve, forced a billion-dollar institution to see itself and change. Under the sweltering noon sun of Atlanta, the marble facade of Granite South Bank glinted like polished armor. Inside, the air was brisk and still, perfumed with espresso and cologne, stitched together by whispered transactions and the quiet rustle of luxury. Byron Ellis, a 42-year-old black executive and founder of a renewable infrastructure startup, stepped through the sliding glass doors with the calm of someone who'd earned his seat in every room he entered, at least on paper. Byron wasn't just another entrepreneur seeking capital. He'd already raised over $18 million in seed funding, helped transform 2 failing municipal energy grids, and had earned a national award for innovation in sustainable technology. But none of that currency translated inside the lobby of Granite South. Here, worth wasn't determined by track record. It was silently calculated in subtle glances, color-coded assumptions, and how quickly the receptionist decided whether you belonged. The woman at the front desk looked up briefly, offered a restrained smile, and returned her gaze to the screen before Byron could introduce himself. She didn't ask his name. No greeting, no warmth. Only, after he spoke, clearly and confidently, did she begin the process of checking him in. His appointment was confirmed. His presence, however, was treated like an interruption. "Have a seat. Mr. Langley will see you shortly." Byron's time was monetized, just like any other business leader's, yet here it became negotiable. As he settled into a leather chair beneath an ornate chandelier, a quiet pattern began to reveal itself. A white man in a tan suit arrived 10 minutes later and was ushered in within moments. No ID check, no delay. A blonde woman followed, well-dressed, no appointment, and received the same seamless treatment. They were not just clients, they were assumptions fulfilled. As the minutes stretched into an hour, then an hour and a half, Byron recognized what was unfolding. Not a mistake, a mechanism. A process polished until plausible, where no one raises their voice because nothing seems overtly wrong. But beneath that veneer, something corrosive simmered. An institutional script where politeness masked preference and silence served as policy. Psychologically, the weight of those moments, waiting, being overlooked, felt heavier with each second. Not because of impatience, but because of familiarity. This wasn't Byron's first time being rendered invisible by civility, and it wouldn't be the last. The bank's architecture whispered authority, but the waiting room enforced hierarchy, where deference became a demand rather than a courtesy. Outside, DEI statements and corporate diversity pledges continued to circulate on social media. Inside, though, the lived reality was unchanged. Implicit bias wasn't just tolerated, it was standardized. A flexible client policy meant nothing without transparency. And Byron, despite all his accolades, was being measured by the shape of his face and the shade of his skin long before the thickness of his portfolio. As Byron sat upright, spine straight and eyes forward, he wasn't just enduring, he was preparing. Not to beg, but to challenge, because no amount of success could protect someone from a system built to sort and silence before it ever listened. The first 15 minutes passed without concern. Byron Ellis remained composed, his breathing steady, posture straight. He reminded himself this was a high-level meeting, and delays were common in corporate banking. He had arrived early, just as he always did. But 20 minutes turned to 45. Then an hour. Still, no one approached. The receptionist, whose badge read Chloe, never once looked his way after that initial interaction. Instead, her energy shifted entirely when others arrived. A pair of young consultants, laughing in slim-fit suits, breezed in and were greeted by name. She leaned forward, eyes bright, posture alive. One of them placed a coffee cup on her desk, clearly a routine, and without checking anything on her screen, Chloe stood to escort them herself toward the back. Byron watched it all unfold with the cool awareness of someone used to documenting disparity. Every gesture in this lobby followed an unwritten script. Who was greeted warmly, who was waved past, and who was quietly left to fade into the decor. The lavishness of Granite South wasn't just decoration, it was enforcement. Marble columns and glass panels separated those who belonged from those who merely visited. In this world, power didn't raise its voice. It simply never called your name. Every time the door to the executive corridor opened, Byron glanced up. Each time, it wasn't for him. He checked his watch again, 11:47 a.m. His appointment had been scheduled for 11 o'clock sharp. Still, no explanation, no apology. His presence was treated like background noise, a fixture to be tolerated until removed. Byron adjusted the cuff of his charcoal blazer, then folded his hands on his lap. His leather folio rested neatly at his side, unopened. If he wasn't being recognized for what he brought to the table, then the table itself was a facade. Culturally, these moments weren't foreign. Polite exclusion had replaced the overt rejection of decades past. In its place was something subtler, more palatable to modern institutions: the weaponization of procedure. The rules, always standard, were malleable for those who matched the mold. White men, familiar faces, those with generational ties to wealth, they weren't bound by process. They were the process. Everyone else, including Byron, was expected to wait and smile while doing it. From his seat near the window, Byron began to count the pass-throughs. A woman in a burgundy dress, no appointment, waved in after a brief exchange. A man in khakis and a vest, chatting easily with Chloe, disappeared into the secure hallway after less than 3 minutes. Meanwhile, no one acknowledged Byron, and when he finally stood, subtle but unmistakable, a few heads turned, not in alarm, but in judgment, as if his movement disrupted a curated atmosphere. Byron approached the desk again. "Any update on Mr. Langley?" Chloe didn't flinch. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, eyes locked on the screen. "He's still in a meeting," she said flatly. "He'll be with you shortly." Shortly had lost all meaning. Byron nodded once. "Thank you." He didn't press. He knew pressing wouldn't yield truth. Only further politeness, weaponized. Back in his seat, Byron felt the familiar sensation of microaggression fatigue begin to take hold. The fatigue wasn't physical, but psychological, like sandpaper dragging across his sense of self. It wasn't the delay, it was the accumulation. The way silence was used to diminish, the way smiles were reserved for the right shade of client, and the way everyone else seemed so comfortable with the unspoken rules. The harshest part wasn't Chloe's indifference. It was the quiet compliance of the others, the consultants who never questioned why he waited so long, the staff who greeted others by name but never once made eye contact with him. He wasn't unseen, he was actively filtered out. Outside the bank, discussions about fairness, equity, and inclusion played out in boardrooms and HR webinars. But inside, none of that mattered. Inside, the culture remained unchanged. Polished, procedural, polite. DEI statements had been drafted and posted. But when it came to real implementation, Byron's experience exposed the cracks. A receptionist with unchecked power to delay, a manager unbothered by silence, and a system so used to exclusion that it no longer noticed itself doing it. And yet, Byron did not shrink. He let the silence deepen, let the room continue its performance. But internally, something shifted. His stillness was no longer just polite patience, it was strategic observation. He wasn't waiting for a seat at their table. He was deciding if this table deserved him at all. Somewhere in the distance, a new group entered, laughing, animated, affluent. Chloe stood once again, her voice rising in courtesy, her smile reappearing like it never left. Byron saw her check no schedule, ask no ID, offer no delay. He heard her say the words he hadn't received, "We've been expecting you." Then, like clockwork, they vanished through the frosted glass. The irony wasn't lost on him. In the very institution that prided itself on calculated risk management, bias operated unchecked. Flexible procedures, unrecorded discretion, a reliance on surface impressions. These weren't anomalies. They were mechanisms of control dressed in professionalism. Byron leaned back, adjusting his seat slightly so the sunlight hit his face. He let the warmth remind him that he existed, here, now, fully present. Not invisible, not broken, just momentarily paused in a game that had always been rigged. He wouldn't storm out, he wouldn't raise his voice. But when the time came, he would act. Because no system, no matter how polished, can indefinitely hold back someone who's learned how to wait without disappearing. And Byron had waited long enough. By 12:36 p.m., Byron Ellis had been waiting for over 90 minutes. He had watched the rhythm of the lobby transform. The morning buzz of arrivals had slowed to an early afternoon lull. Chloe now sat idly behind the reception desk, scrolling her screen with absent swipes, occasionally adjusting the gold-toned bracelets on her wrist. The light filtering through the tall glass panes had shifted angles, casting longer shadows across the marble floor. And Byron, still waiting, still unacknowledged, sat unchanged, but not unfeeling. The wait wasn't just in the time lost. It was in every second he was forced to sit silently while others were granted entry. It was in the glazed look Chloe gave him every time he stirred in his seat. It was in the practiced efficiency of the staff who moved effortlessly for others, but let him disappear into the seams of the building. Byron's throat tightened with a cocktail of emotion, frustration, weariness, but above all, clarity. He could no longer pretend this delay was random. He wasn't a priority, not because of his file, not because of his business proposal, but because of how he looked when he walked through the door. This wasn't unfamiliar ground. Byron had grown up in Montgomery, Alabama, the son of a retired postal worker and a public school teacher. From an early age, he was taught to dress neatly, speak clearly, and be early, always early. Not to impress, but to counter the assumptions that preceded him. In high school, he'd worn suits to scholarship interviews while his peers arrived in jeans. At Princeton, he'd sat in the front row of every seminar, determined never to be overlooked. He knew the rules, and he'd played by them all. But today, here in this bank, the rules had turned against him, not by shouting, by silence. He reached for his leather folio, opened it, and removed a single sheet, a letter of recommendation signed by a U.S. senator who'd backed his infrastructure project. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it shut again. That kind of clout might earn respect in other spaces, but here, it was as if the people in charge didn't care to look long enough to see it. Byron stood slowly. He didn't pace, didn't sigh, didn't slam his hands or raise his voice. Instead, he straightened his blazer, picked up his briefcase, and walked deliberately, not toward the door, but toward the executive corridor. The one guarded by a frosted glass door. The one Chloe had held open for at least 6 other clients that morning. The one he now approached without permission. "Sir," Chloe called out, rising halfway from her seat. "You can't go back there." Her voice cracked, soft but uncertain. Not because Byron had done anything aggressive, but because he had broken the unwritten rule: wait to be summoned or be punished for stepping forward. He stopped just short of the door and turned, not confrontationally but with a calm finality. "I've waited an hour and a half past my scheduled time," he said, his tone steady. "I'm no longer asking for entry, I'm moving forward." Chloe's lips parted slightly, then closed again. She didn't follow. She didn't protest further. With a quiet push, Byron opened the frosted door and stepped through. The corridor was hushed, the sound of his footsteps absorbed by thick gray carpet. A row of mahogany doors lined the walls, each marked with a brass nameplate. Byron scanned them quickly. At the far end, Christopher Langley, Regional Director. He approached without hesitation, his pulse calm now, like the calm that comes not from peace, but from decision. He knocked once, firm, then opened the door. Inside sat Langley, silver-haired, wearing a crisp blue dress shirt with sleeves slightly rolled. He looked up mid-sentence, surprised to see someone entering. Seated across from him was another man in a plaid sport coat, mid-conversation. "I'm sorry," Langley said, frowning slightly. "We're in a meeting." Byron didn't retreat. "I'm Byron Ellis. I've been scheduled to meet with you since 11 a.m. I've waited over 90 minutes in your lobby. While others came and went, I wasn't acknowledged. I'm here to begin the meeting I was promised." Langley blinked. The other man turned to look at Byron with sudden curiosity. There was no anger in Byron's voice, no visible outrage. But there was something else. Undeniable presence. Not the kind granted by status. The kind taken when patience has run out and dignity demands action. Langley stood slowly. "Give us a moment," he said to his visitor. As the man exited, Byron took the open seat, not because he was offered it, but because it was his. This was no longer about a meeting. This was about drawing a boundary in a place where none had been offered. In that small act, walking through the door, Byron hadn't just defied silent protocol, he had ended it. The door shut behind Byron Ellis with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have. Inside the office of Christopher Langley, Regional Director of Granite South Bank, time did not pause, but it did narrow. The usual corporate hum of email alerts, air conditioning vents, and shuffling paper fell into the background. What remained was an air thick with expectancy. Langley moved behind his desk, adjusting his collar as though trying to reassert control of the moment. His voice, practiced and even, carried a faint edge of discomfort. "Mr. Ellis, while I appreciate your initiative, we do maintain a structure here. You should have waited until someone came to retrieve you." Byron didn't blink. He kept his tone calm even, but unyielding. "I did, for over an hour and a half. I followed every rule you set. But it's clear that the structure you're referring to only seems to work for certain people." Langley's face tightened. He gestured to the chair across from him, but Byron was already seated. That gesture, like many others today, had arrived too late. "You were scheduled for 11 o'clock, I believe?" Langley asked, glancing at the clock as if it might validate him. "I was. I arrived early. I confirmed with your receptionist. And then I watched as 6 other clients, all white, most walk-ins, were ushered through that same hallway without delay or explanation. I don't believe that was an accident." Langley leaned back, folding his hands in front of him. A classic posture of control. But Byron had seen it before, on investors who mistook politeness for passivity, on VCs who assumed his calm was submission. He knew the dance. "We do handle VIP cases with some flexibility," Langley replied. "Some clients have direct relationships with senior staff or priority status based on investment tiers. That may explain what you observed." "Does priority status come with a dress code, a skin tone?" Byron asked. Langley's composure slipped for half a second, then returned. "Of course not. We do not discriminate here." It was the kind of statement that institutions kept in their back pockets, not because they believed it, but because they needed it. Byron leaned forward, voice sharpened but never raised. "I didn't come here to accuse you with hashtags. I came here because I was told this bank supports innovation, entrepreneurship, and community advancement. I'm leading a renewable infrastructure project that's already been greenlit in 2 states. Your office called me. But when I walked through your doors, I became a second-tier priority. Not because of my file, because of my face." Langley hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty passed through his eyes. He looked toward the screen on his desk, then back at Byron. "We may have had some miscommunication at the front. I'll look into it." "You don't need to look into it," Byron replied, firm. "You need to own it." That stopped Langley cold. Byron continued, his words slow, intentional. "What happened out there wasn't a glitch in your system. It was the system working exactly as designed for a particular kind of client. The ones who look like they belong, who don't wait, who walk in and know someone will be ready for them, regardless of appointments." Langley opened a folder on his desk, as if to retreat to documents, safe ground. "Let's review your proposal." Byron didn't budge. "We will, but not before you acknowledge what just happened." A silence stretched between them. Not empty, but heavy, charged. Byron held Langley's gaze, refusing to let the moment slip into procedural amnesia. Finally, Langley exhaled through his nose. "I can see how this morning's events may have left you feeling disrespected." Byron gave a dry, knowing smile. Number not feeling. "I was disrespected." Langley nodded slightly. "You're right. It should not have taken this long for someone to meet with you. And if our reception process allowed personal bias to influence the flow of clients, that's something we must address." Byron studied him. The words were measured, but they weren't empty. "This isn't just about me," Byron said. "It's about the thousands of people who walk into places like this and get told, without ever hearing the words, that they're not the right kind of client, that their money, their ideas, their time doesn't weigh the same." Langley sat straighter. "Then let's make sure that changes." In that moment, the dynamic shifted. Not because Byron shouted or Langley capitulated, but because the room itself had been forced to bear witness to a truth that could no longer be wallpapered over with formality. Langley opened Byron's file again, more slowly this time. "Your proposal is impressive," he said. "Your financials are solid. We'd be foolish to turn this away. Let's start over. From the top. No assumptions." Byron nodded. He allowed the silence to sit for a moment longer before speaking. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm demanding equal ground. That's all I've ever wanted." Langley extended his hand. Byron paused, then took it. No smiles. Just understanding. The meeting began, but the real work had already started. The moment Byron refused to wait 1 second longer. The moment had just begun to settle when a sharp knock echoed from the office door. Before either man could respond, the door swung open. 3 figures stepped into the room. At the front stood Elaine Rutledge, President and CEO of Granite South Bank. Dressed in a sleek charcoal gray pantsuit with a deep red blouse underneath, She radiated the quiet command of someone used to moving entire rooms with a glance. Her dark almond eyes scanned the space, first registering Langley's stiffened posture, then shifting to Byron Ellis. Still seated, still composed, but unmistakably in control. Flanking her were two executive board members, both men in their 60s wearing tailored navy suits. One held a tablet. The other adjusted his cufflinks with nervous precision. Langley immediately rose, smoothing his sleeves, his voice tightening. "Miss Rutledge, this is unexpected." Elaine didn't answer him. Her gaze stayed locked on Byron. "Mr. Ellis," she said, stepping forward, "I wasn't aware you were meeting with our Houston regional office today." Byron stood, extending his hand. "Neither was I until I sat in the lobby for over 90 minutes and realized no one intended to meet me at all." The room froze. Elaine took his hand, shaking it firmly. "I'm sorry, that should never have happened." Langley shifted uncomfortably beside them, his eyes flicking to the board members, searching for rescue. None came. Elaine turned toward him. "Christopher, I'd like to hear exactly what caused this delay. From you." Langley cleared his throat. "There appears to have been confusion at the reception desk. Mr. Ellis's name may not have been properly prioritized in the appointment system." Byron tilted his head slightly, interjecting with surgical precision. 6 clients, all white, arrived after me, some without appointments. All were escorted in. I watched every one of them go through those doors. I was the only one left in the lobby by the time I walked myself back here. One of the board members raised his brows. The other tapped on his tablet. Elaine's eyes didn't blink. Reception marked Mr. Ellis's arrival at 10:49 a.m. "That's 11 minutes before the scheduled time," she stated. "Is that accurate?" Langley hesitated. "Yes, that aligns." Elaine continued. "Then explain to me why he wasn't seen until he entered this room without being called." Langley stammered. "It appears there was a lapse in oversight. I take full responsibility." Elaine's tone never changed. "No, Christopher. This isn't about oversight. This is about a pattern. One that we've been warned about in multiple internal DEI reviews. Client sorting based on subjective impressions rather than formal priority protocols." She turned back to Byron. "I read your proposal last month. Your name's familiar because our national team marked your project as a high-impact sustainability investment. I intended to meet with you personally. When you came to New York, next quarter, Byron didn't flinch. I wasn't planning on starting with confrontation either. But the system made that decision for me." Elaine nodded. "I understand, and I appreciate that you didn't walk away. Most would have." The room's power balance had flipped entirely. Byron no longer sat across from a gatekeeper. He stood beside the one person with authority over the entire institution. Elaine took a step forward and addressed the room with quiet conviction. "Let me be clear. This isn't about salvaging a meeting. This is about culture, about the invisible metrics we allow to shape how we treat people. Every ignored email, every receptionist who smiles at one face and not another, every unexplained delay, it adds up. Not just for our clients, but for who we are as an organization." She turned to the board members. "I want a full audit of our client handling practices at all regional branches, starting with Houston. I also want a review of all flagged reception incidents from the past 6 months. If patterns appear, they must be addressed immediately." Both board members nodded. One began typing into his device. Langley swallowed hard. "If I may, I've always upheld standards here." Elaine raised a hand, silencing him. "Standards aren't just about procedures, Christopher. They're about presence. Mr. Ellis was made to feel invisible in a space that should have recognized him the moment he walked through the door. You didn't see him. Your receptionist didn't see him. But now we all do, and it's too late to pretend otherwise. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was necessary. A silence not of confusion, but revelation. Elaine turned to Byron. Let's not waste more of your time. Your project deserves full consideration. Please join me in the board conference room. We'll review the proposal directly. You've waited long enough. Byron didn't move right away. He looked back at Langley, not with contempt, but with clarity. This, Byron said, is what real leadership looks like. And this is the reason systems like yours don't change, until someone forces them to look in the mirror. He followed Elaine out of the room. The board members trailed behind. Langley remained motionless, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He wasn't reprimanded, he was revealed, and that was worse. In the hallway, Byron walked with purpose beside the CEO. The energy around them shifted, staff rising from desks, whispers trailing in their wake. A receptionist looked up from her screen as he passed. This time, her gaze lingered, not with judgment, but with recognition. Elaine opened the boardroom door herself. After this, we'll be sending a message, not just about what happened today, but about how we move forward. Byron stepped into the room and paused. No more silent waiting, he said quietly. Not for me, not for anyone who walks through those doors again. Elaine nodded. That's a promise I intend to keep. And with that, the meeting began, not as a favor, but as a reckoning long overdue. The boardroom, with its panoramic skyline view of downtown Houston and gleaming glass table that reflected sunlight like a mirror, had seen countless strategy sessions, quarterly reviews, and executive lunches. But today, it bore witness to something far rarer: accountability. Elaine Rutledge sat at the head of the table. Byron Ellis sat opposite her, no longer a visitor, no longer waiting for permission to be heard. Flanking them were the two Granite South board members, both visibly alert. No one tapped a phone. No one checked email. The room was tuned to a single frequency. Elaine leaned forward, her voice measured but firm. Byron, I'd like you to recount everything that happened from the moment you entered the building. Byron nodded, then began. He didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. The facts alone told the story. The receptionist's flat indifference. The stream of white clients who were greeted with warmth and ushered in without question. The names he overheard. The people who walked past him. The silence that grew louder with every passing minute. I wasn't forgotten, he said plainly. I was disregarded. Elaine sat still, but the expression in her eyes shifted, an internal ledger being rewritten in real time. She turned to one of the board members, a tall man with thick gray eyebrows and a reputation for quiet but thorough leadership. I want Chloe Wallace, our front desk associate, relieved of client-facing duties immediately, she said, pending a full HR review. The man nodded without hesitation. Elaine continued. Pull the building's visitor logs from the last 90 days. Cross-reference arrival times with who was seen, how quickly, and whether any written policies were actually followed. The second board member, a woman with sharp glasses and a background in compliance, added, We also need to review all recorded reception footage. If Byron's claims align with the behavior patterns we find, this becomes more than a personnel issue. It becomes a liability. Byron watched this unfold in real time, leaders shifting from passive policy to active self-scrutiny. But he also knew what often followed these conversations: apology theater, one-time gestures, and silence resuming once the pressure lifted. So he pressed forward. "This isn't about punishing individuals," he said. "It's about fixing a structure that rewards bias with plausible deniability. When staff are given unchecked discretion to decide who gets access, those decisions aren't neutral. They reflect everything from skin tone to perceived wealth." Elaine nodded. "And they go uncorrected when no one speaks up." Outside the boardroom, the tone of the entire office had changed. Assistants whispered. Mid-level managers walked slower near the conference room, straining to hear any snippet of what was unfolding. Everyone knew something unusual was happening. Elaine turned to Byron again. "We've spoken about your project's technical value, but I also want to speak to the institutional value of this moment." Byron raised an eyebrow slightly. "You've exposed a pattern we've long suspected," she said. "And now that we see it clearly, we have an obligation to fix it, not with memos, with measurable change." She clicked her tablet, then read aloud. "Effective immediately. Granite South Bank will initiate a 4-part corrective framework. First, a public statement acknowledging this incident and our failure to uphold inclusive client engagement. Second, the hiring of an external equity auditor to assess all regional offices' reception and intake procedures. Third, mandatory retraining of all front-facing staff, led not by HR but by independent facilitators trained in systemic bias and accountability." She paused, locking eyes with Byron. "And fourth, we want your feedback in building a real-time client intake protocol, something visible, trackable, and transparent." Byron leaned back slightly. He hadn't expected this level of responsiveness. Not here. Not from a corporate institution that had, just 90 minutes ago, left him marinating in quiet erasure. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I also hope you understand. This isn't about me alone. What happened today has happened to others who didn't have a senator's letter or a clean balance sheet, who walked out the door thinking they weren't worth the wait." Elaine nodded. "And that's what we're going to change." The room fell into a moment of contemplative silence. Then Byron's phone buzzed. A notification from his email app lit up. Subject: Approval. Notification: Granite South Clean Energy Grant Application. From Granite South Investment Division. Time: 1:23 p.m. He didn't smile, not because it didn't matter, but because the approval, while welcome, wasn't the victory. The real win was that the institution had been forced to see itself and correct course. One of the board members glanced at the email across the table. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "But also, thank you." Byron nodded once, then stood. Elaine stood with him. "You'll receive a formal letter from me and the board this evening," she said. "We want your voice involved in future oversight if you're open to it." Byron offered a firm handshake. "Let's make sure this isn't a one-day fix." She met his grip. "It won't be." As Byron stepped out of the boardroom, the atmosphere had changed. Receptionists straightened in their chairs. Junior associates offered nods they'd withheld earlier. Not out of fear, but out of newfound respect. The system had been cracked open, and this time, everyone had seen what spilled out. For Byron Ellis, the fight for equity didn't end with an apology or an approved loan. It continued through every policy rewritten, every assumption re-examined, and every client who walked in after him. No longer forced to wait quietly for the dignity they already deserved. Byron Ellis descended the staircase from the executive floor with unhurried steps. There was no rush anymore, no pressure to prove himself, no need to check his watch. For the first time that day, the weight of silence had lifted. Not because the system had welcomed him, but because he had refused to be shut out of it. As he passed through the lobby, something subtle but powerful had shifted. The receptionist, who once avoided his gaze, now sat rigid, hands folded tightly over the desk. Her eyes flicked up briefly, but Byron didn't stop. He didn't need to. There was no confrontation left to have. The moment had already spoken. Outside, Houston's afternoon sun blazed across the sidewalk. Byron paused just beyond the doors of Granite South Bank. He inhaled deeply, the scent of sun-warmed concrete and cut grass mixing with the metallic tang of nearby traffic. He stood in the same city, but not the same place. Inside that building, structural change had been set in motion, and outside, something more personal had taken root. He reached for his phone and tapped open the email once more. "Your application has been approved." The subject line wasn't what made him pause. It was the timestamp, sent within minutes of the boardroom decision. That speed, that clarity wasn't routine, it was intentional. It meant someone had been listening. But Byron's victory wasn't about one email or even one policy change. It was about the unmistakable fact that today, a system built to exclude had been made to reckon with itself and had moved. He thought about his mother back in Montgomery, a retired school teacher who'd raised him with a steady belief that dignity must be claimed before it's offered. She used to say, "Son, if the door won't open, don't knock harder. Find your own key." Byron smiled softly. Today, he hadn't just found the key. He'd used it to unlock a door that others would walk through after him. Behind him, the bank would begin executing its new measures. The external audit, the retraining, the public statement, all of it carried forward under the weight of public visibility and internal shame. But Byron knew something deeper had changed, too. The CEO's posture, the board's urgency, the stillness in the lobby staff. These weren't signs of a box being checked. They were signals of institutional disruption, the kind that doesn't vanish once headlines fade. And for Byron, that meant more than a successful deal. It meant legacy. Later that evening, Byron sat at a cafe a few blocks away, laptop open, reflecting on how the day had unfolded. His inbox now held 3 messages from Granite South: the official approval letter, a personal note of apology from Elaine Rutledge, and an invitation to join a temporary oversight committee focused on client equity in intake procedures. He reread Elaine's message. Today was a wake-up call. Not because we didn't know we had blind spots, but because someone held a mirror up when we least expected it. We need people like you, not to fix what we broke, but to help rebuild what we never fully built right. I hope you'll lend your voice, not just your signature." Byron considered the offer. He wasn't sure yet, but what he was sure of, what mattered most, was that his presence, his persistence, had triggered a shift larger than himself. Across his screen, messages from colleagues and partners trickled in. Word had spread. Not about the confrontation, but about the outcome. A respected, clean energy project had broken through a gate kept by bias, and done it by forcing a system to pause, reflect, and act. And yet, Byron felt no urge to celebrate. Vindication, he realized, wasn't about applause. It was about restoration, of value, of humanity, of voice. The next morning, a local business journal published a headline: "Granite South faces internal audit after CEO responds to equity failure at Houston branch." The article didn't name Byron directly, but insiders knew, and more importantly, the people who'd been ignored, dismissed, or told to wait, they knew too. That headline was just a surface ripple. The real reform was already moving underground, like roots breaking concrete. Byron closed his laptop and leaned back, watching the early evening traffic roll by. Somewhere, someone was entering a bank, hoping to be treated like they belonged. And because of today, they just might be. Not because the receptionist smiled, but because the system, finally, had been made to look inward and asked itself who it was truly built to serve. And for the first time in a long time, the answer was beginning to change. Byron Ellis stood beneath the awning of a city bus stop, just outside the shadow of Granite South Bank's silver tower. The sun had begun its descent behind the high-rises, casting long streaks of gold across the pavement. A gentle breeze swept past, rustling his coat collar. For the first time all day, there was no pressure on him to speak, to perform, to assert. Only space dash a space to reflect. He turned and looked back at the building. The same building that had, just hours earlier, acted as a fortress of polite exclusion, now stood altered. Not in architecture, but in memory. It was no longer just a bank. It was the scene of an awakening. The changes that had been promised would take time. Audits, policy shifts, new training programs. They would roll out over weeks and months. Some may succeed, some may be diluted, but none of it would go unnoticed again. Because Byron had made sure of that. He stepped onto the sidewalk and began walking east. Each footfall was steady, calm, but resolute. He wasn't in a hurry, not anymore. What he'd carried into that bank wasn't just a business proposal or a pitch deck. It was the accumulated weight of every door that took too long to open, every hallway where his worth had to be reproven, and every waiting room that doubled as a test of endurance. And today, he had refused to wait quietly. The moment he crossed the lobby floor without permission, he had crossed a deeper threshold, one where legacy begins not with speeches or victories, but with unflinching resolve in the face of subtle disrespect. Legacy, Byron had come to realize, isn't built in boardrooms. It's built in moments when silence breaks. As he reached the corner of the block, he passed a row of high school students gathered around a street artist sketching portraits on the sidewalk. One of them, maybe 16, wearing a hoodie and backpack, caught his eye and gave a slight nod of recognition. Byron nodded back, not with a smile of pride, but with a quiet sense of connection. Because that young man might walk into a place like Granite South someday. He might sit in a lobby and wonder why his name doesn't get called. And Byron hoped, earnestly, that what happened today would ripple forward, creating a world where that boy wouldn't have to carry the same weight. Not because he deserved special treatment, but because he deserved equal footing. At the crosswalk, Byron paused and reached for his phone. A new notification blinked across the screen. Subject: Internal Memo. Immediate policy update on client engagement protocols. From Office of the CEO, Granite South Time, 6:42 p.m. He tapped it open and scanned the language. It was clear, direct, and unapologetic. The memo confirmed that all regional branches would adopt a new transparency standard in client reception procedures. Anonymous tracking logs, real-time intake verification, staff reevaluation, and most critically, public accountability checkpoints reviewed by a rotating oversight board that would include clients. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was more than he had expected when he'd first walked through that frosted glass door earlier in the day. He slid the phone back into his pocket and crossed the street.